She said only 2 words on the emergency channel, Falcon 1, and 2 fighter pilots armed for a kill order suddenly went silent. What they didn't know, the voice belonged to a legend they'd been told was dead for 5 years. By the end, you'll understand why ghosts sometimes fly better than the living. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Nobody on Skyline Air Flight 409 noticed the woman in seat 12A. That was, in a way, the whole point of her life now. Commander Kate Ellison, though nobody on this flight knew that name either, sat with a paperback novel open on her lap, the pages unturned for the last 40 minutes. She was 39 years old, dressed in a gray cardigan and jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. To the flight attendants she was a quiet middle-seat passenger who'd asked for extra ice in her water and nothing else. To the man beside her, an insurance adjuster from Denver who tried twice to start a conversation about turbulence, she was politely uninterested. 5 years ago, the call sign Falcon 1 belonged to her, and to almost nobody else. It had been retired the day she was. She had been the lead test pilot and chief instructor at a classified evaluation squadron that most of the United States Air Force didn't officially know existed, a unit that took experimental airframes and pushed them past the edges of their flight envelopes so that operational pilots never had to find those edges themselves. She had trained 41 fighter pilots in 6 years. 2 of them, she had reason to believe, were flying escorts somewhere over this very stretch of sky tonight, though she had no way of knowing that yet. Kate's career, and her name, had ended over the Nevada desert on a test flight that went into the official record as a total loss with no survivors. The truth was stranger and colder than that, a catastrophic structural failure in an experimental airframe, an ejection at a speed and altitude that should have killed her, a recovery so quiet and so deeply classified that even her own service treated her as dead. The program that flew her had decided a live legend was more dangerous to keep than a dead one. She had been offered a choice that wasn't really a choice: vanish into a new identity working airframe safety analysis for a defense contractor, or spend the rest of her career fighting a bureaucracy that would rather she didn't exist. She chose to vanish. The transition had not been gentle. For the first year, she had woken most mornings still expecting the smell of jet fuel and the particular cold of a pre-dawn flight line, only to find herself in a rented apartment 3 states away from anyone who had ever known her real name. She learned to answer to Kate Ellison the way a person learns a foreign language, haltingly at first, then so thoroughly that some mornings she almost believed it herself. She took a desk job reviewing failure mode reports for airframes she was no longer allowed to fly, translating the same instincts that had once kept her alive at Mach 2 into paragraphs of dry technical prose that nobody outside a small circle of engineers would ever read closely. It paid well. It kept her near airplanes, in a manner of speaking. It was, by any reasonable measure, a safe and sensible life. She told herself that most days. Tonight, sitting quietly in seat 12A with a paperback she hadn't actually been reading, she almost believed it too. 5 years of silence. 5 years of watching military aircraft cross the sky above her and feeling nothing but a dull ache where a career used to be. 5 years of catching herself, at odd moments, waiting in a grocery store line, half asleep on a red eye like this one, running through emergency checklists for aircraft she was never again supposed to touch, purely out of habit, purely because some part of her refused to fully power down. She was flying home from a conference in Seattle, an unremarkable 2-day event on composite fatigue testing that she had sat through mostly in silence, contributing exactly enough to seem engaged without drawing attention. Her carry-on held a laptop, a change of clothes, and one small object she had never been able to make herself leave behind, a compact dual-band aviation transceiver, obsolete by current military standards but functional, tucked into the false bottom of a laptop sleeve like a relic from a religion she'd been forced to abandon. She told people, when she thought about it at all, that she kept it out of nostalgia. Nothing about tonight was supposed to be complicated. The first sign of trouble on Flight 409 was small enough that most of the cabin missed it entirely, a flicker in the cabin lighting, there and gone in under a second, the kind of thing a tired traveler blames on a bad connection somewhere in the wiring. Kate did not miss it. She felt the subtle change in the pressurization hum a half-second later, a shift so faint that unless a person had spent a decade learning to listen to aircraft the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, they would never register it at all. Her eyes moved instinctively to the overhead vents, then to the seatback screen showing their position. Somewhere over eastern Colorado, the little airplane icon frozen against a stylized map. Frozen. Not moving. A minute later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, clipped and professional but carrying the particular tightness Kate recognized from 100 simulator sessions gone wrong. "Folks, we're dealing with a minor electrical issue up here. Nothing to be concerned about. Flight attendants, please take your seats for a few minutes while we sort this out." Minor electrical issue. Kate turned the phrase over and didn't like the taste of it. An electrical fault serious enough to be announced, on an aircraft this size, this new, was rarely minor. She thought of cascading bus failures, of avionics systems dropping offline one after another like dominoes, of a flight crew suddenly losing pieces of the airplane they depended on to know where they were and where they were going. Then the cabin lights failed completely, plunging the aircraft into the dim blue emergency glow of the floor lighting strips, and this time there was no ambiguity at all. Somewhere near the front of the plane, a child began to cry. The insurance adjuster beside Kate gripped his armrest hard enough that his knuckles went white. Around her, the cabin settled into the particular restless quiet of 300 people trying to convince themselves everything was fine. A mother too rose up, murmured softly to a toddler who had woken from the flicker of the lights. The insurance adjuster beside Kate pulled out his phone, saw no signal bars, and put it away again with a small, unconvincing laugh. Kate kept her eyes on the seatback screen, on the little frozen airplane icon that refused to move, and felt the old, familiar tightening low in her chest that she hadn't experienced in 5 years, not fear exactly, but the sharpened, narrowing focus of a mind that had been trained for a decade to treat every anomaly as data rather than danger. She began, almost without meaning to, running the same mental checklist she'd have run in a cockpit. Cabin lighting flicker, then loss, consistent with a bus tie fault or a fire suppression system triggering automatically somewhere after the flight deck. Seatback displays frozen rather than blank, consistent with a data bus failure rather than total electrical loss, meaning some systems were still drawing power while others had gone dark, a pattern, in her experience, that pointed toward a localized fire eating through a specific wiring bundle rather than a total generator failure. It was not the profile of sabotage. It was the profile of an aircraft slowly losing pieces of itself from the inside. 20 minutes passed in a fog of murmured reassurances from a flight crew who, Kate suspected from the strain audible under their professionalism, understood the severity of the situation far better than they were letting on. The intercom crackled again. "This is your captain. We've lost primary radio contact with air traffic control. We are not declaring an emergency at this time, but as a precaution." The transmission cut off mid-sentence. Static hissed through the cabin speakers for 3 full seconds before silence returned. Kate's stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with altitude. A total communications failure on a modern airliner was vanishingly rare. Most systems carried enough redundancy that losing every channel at once suggested either a fire in the avionics bay eating through cable bundles, or a fault far more fundamental than anyone in that cockpit wanted to say out loud over a live intercom. Either way, from the ground, from an air traffic control screen that had just gone dark on a radar-identified target squawking no transponder code at all, it would look like exactly one thing. It would look like a hijacking. 200 miles to the north, at an Air National Guard base tucked into the foothills, the alert klaxon tore through a quiet Tuesday evening. First Lieutenant Marcus Whiskey Delgado was 3 bites into a cold sandwich when the horn went off. He was moving before his brain fully caught up with his legs, sprinting across the tarmac toward his F-16, fingers already working the zipper on his flight suit. Beside him, jogging in perfect step out of 6 years of shared habit, was Captain Renata Ice Suarez, his flight lead. "Radar contact lost transponder over eastern Colorado," the operations duty officer shouted after them as they ran. "Civilian heavy, 300+ souls, last known altitude flight level 310. No radio contact in 19 minutes. FAA's calling it a possible hijack. You are weapons tight until told otherwise. Get eyes on that airplane. 9 minutes later, two F-16s tore into a black sky thick with stars, afterburners glowing orange against the dark. Neither pilot spoke much on the climb out, there wasn't much to say yet, and both of them had long ago learned that a quiet cockpit before a hard intercept was a professional cockpit. Delgado had been flying fighters for 6 years, 4 of them operational, and in that time he had scrambled on a dozen intercepts that turned out to be nothing, a wandering private pilot who drifted into restricted airspace, a transponder glitch, once memorably a flock of geese that had spooked a regional radar site into calling a full alert. This one felt different from the first radio call. There was a flatness in the duty officer's voice, a controlled urgency that experienced fighter pilots learned to read the way sailors read a change in the wind. 300 souls. No radio contact in 19 minutes and climbing. It was the kind of scramble that stayed with a person regardless of how it ended. He ran his own mental checklist as the altimeter climbed past 20,000 feet, more out of habit than necessity: fuel state, weapon status, radio discipline, the small mechanical rituals that kept a mind steady when the alternative was thinking too hard about what might be waiting for them at the top of the climb. Whiskey, ice, radar contact, Suarez called out as her scope painted the wide, slow-moving return of a wide-body airliner holding a straight and level heading that, worryingly, looked less like evasive hijacker behavior and more like an autopilot nobody was actively flying. Merging. Pushing for visual. The two fighters closed the distance in a matter of minutes, sliding into loose formation on either side of the massive airliner. Under the wing lights, its fuselage gleamed pale silver against the black sky, running lights blinking steadily, cabin windows dark. Delgado eased his F-16 in close enough to see through the cockpit glass. What he saw made his blood run cold. Both pilot seats were occupied, two figures slumped forward against their harnesses, motionless, heads down. No movement. No response to the fighters now flanking them close enough to touch. Command, Whiskey, Delgado radioed, his voice flat with the discipline of a man forcing calm into his own throat. I have visual on the flight deck. Both crew appear incapacitated. No response to our presence. There was a long pause on the command net before the answer came back, and when it did, it carried a weight that settled into both cockpits like lead. Whiskey, ice, be advised, we have unconfirmed intelligence this aircraft may be carrying a device. Repeat, unconfirmed. Command is assessing options. Maintain intercept position and stand by for further instructions. Weapons remain tight. Suarez's voice, when she spoke, had lost its usual dry edge. Copy, command. Standing by. Then, on their private frequency, quieter, Whiskey. 300 people on that jet. I know, Delgado said. I know. Inside the darkened cabin, panic was beginning to spread in the particular quiet way panic spreads on an airplane, not shouting, not chaos, but a rising tide of whispered questions and trembling hands, the collective realization of several hundred people that something had gone deeply wrong and no one in charge was telling them what. A businessman across the aisle kept pressing his call button uselessly, the small overhead light glowing amber above his seat with no flight attendant free to answer it. Somewhere behind Kate, a teenager was quietly crying into her sweatshirt sleeve while her father held her hand and stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. The particular helplessness of it, 300 people sealed inside a metal tube 7 miles above the ground with absolutely no way to influence their own fate, pressed down on the cabin like a physical weight. Kate sat perfectly still, running the same calculations she had run 1,000 times in a simulator that no longer officially existed. A total avionics and communications failure. A crew that had gone silent rather than simply lost radio. Silent meant something had happened to them directly, not just to the equipment. Toxic fumes from an electrical fire were her worst guess, a wiring fault in the environmental system pumping smoke into the flight deck faster than either pilot could don an oxygen mask, an insidious kind of catastrophe that could incapacitate 2 trained professionals in under a minute without a single scream reaching the cabin behind them. She had read accident reports on failures like this during her years reviewing airframe safety data, dry technical paragraphs that had never felt real to her until this exact moment, sitting powerless in seat 12A while the same nightmare played out 30 feet in front of her. And outside her window, close enough now that she could make out the pilot's helmet in the glow of the instrument panel, was an F-16. She recognized the aircraft instinctively, the sharp bubble canopy, the single tail, the way it hung in formation with a stillness that only came from a very good pilot working very hard to fly slow next to something enormous. She recognized, too, exactly what that formation meant. Nobody flew that close to an unresponsive airliner unless command was actively weighing whether to shoot it down. Kate had spent 5 years telling herself she was done. That the woman who used to fly formation off wingtips just like that one no longer existed, that Kate Ellison from seat 12A had nothing left to offer anyone. She looked at the two pilots slumped in the cockpit up front, at the two fighters flanking a plane full of sleeping children and tired businessmen, and something in her, something she had buried under 5 years of quiet, refused to sit still any longer. She reached into her carry-on, into the false bottom of a laptop sleeve that held the one piece of her old life she had never been able to throw away, a compact aviation transceiver, dual band, the kind of thing a woman who used to fly for a living kept out of habit more than necessity. She had told herself for years it was sentiment. Tonight it was the only tool she had. She dialed to the International Guard frequency, 121.5, the same channel every aircraft in distress and every fighter in the sky was required to monitor. She pressed the transmit key, and for the first time in 5 years, she said a name she was never supposed to say again. Falcon 1. 2 words. That was all. She said nothing else, offered no explanation, gave no rank or aircraft or authentication code, because in the world she had come from, that call sign, spoken on that frequency, in that exact clipped cadence, was itself the authentication. It was a call that only ever meant one thing to anyone who had trained under it, that the person on the other end of the radio was who they claimed to be, because nobody outside a locked room in Nevada had ever been taught to say it that way. In the cockpit of his F-16, First Lieutenant Marcus Delgado went completely silent. For 3 full seconds, neither Delgado nor Suarez said a word. On the recorded tapes later pulled by the Incident Review Board, those 3 seconds of dead air would become the most discussed silence in the entire operation. Delgado had heard that call sign exactly once before in his life, spoken in exactly that cadence, by exactly one instructor, a woman who had taught him to fly an airframe faster and harder than he had ever flown anything before or since, who had pulled him out of a flat spin in a simulator with a calm voice and 3 words of correction when every instinct in his body was screaming to eject. A woman whose funeral he had attended, whose name was etched on a small brass plaque in a building most of the Air Force didn't know existed, whose death he had carried as a quiet weight for 5 years. "Whiskey, you copy that?" Suarez's voice finally broke through, and it wasn't steady either. "I copy," Delgado said. His hands had gone still on the stick, the fighter momentarily flying itself on trimmed autopilot while his mind reeled. "Ice, that's not possible." Unknown transmission, the command net cut in, sharp and businesslike, oblivious to what had just detonated quietly in both cockpits. "Identify yourself immediately. This is a restricted frequency." Kate keyed the mic again from seat 12A, her voice low, urgent, pitched just above a whisper so the rows around her wouldn't hear. "Command, be advised, your flight crew is not incapacitated by hostile action. I say again, negative hostile action. This has the signature of an electrical fire in the ENE bay. Smoke and toxic fumes in the flight deck, fast onset, before either pilot could reach oxygen. Cabin systems failing in cascade as the fire spreads through shared wiring runs. This aircraft is not a threat. It is a medical emergency with 300 lives on board, and it is running out of time. Identify yourself," the command controller repeated, sharper now. Kate hesitated for exactly 1 second, the same hesitation she had lived with for 5 years, the choice between staying safely dead and stepping back into a life that had once tried to erase her. "This is retired United States Air Force test pilot Kate Ellison," she said. "Former callsign Falcon 1, Chief Instructor, Classified Evaluation Program, Groom Lake Detachment. I am a passenger on this aircraft. I have flight training on systems substantially similar to this airframe, and I am telling you that a missile solves nothing here except guaranteeing every soul on this plane dies in the next 90 seconds instead of finding out whether we can save them." On the command net, a new voice entered, older, heavier, carrying the particular authority of someone who had just been handed information above his pay grade and needed to move fast. "Say again your identification." "Sir, there is no time," Kate said, and something in her voice, the exact tone that had once talked panicked young pilots down from the edge of disaster 100 times, cut through every layer of doubt on that channel. "I need one of your escort pilots to confirm cabin smoke visually through the flight deck windows, and I need someone to get me into that cockpit, because your crew cannot open the door for me and I am the only person on this aircraft who has ever flown anything close to it." Delgado didn't wait for authorization from command before sliding his F-16 in tighter, close enough that the wingtip vortices buffeted his own aircraft, close enough to press his face nearly against the canopy glass and stare directly into the darkened flight deck of Flight 409. "Command, Whiskey, confirmed, I have haze in the cockpit. Looks like smoke, low density, consistent with electrical fire. Crew still not moving." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Falcon 1, Kate, if that's really you, tell me something only you'd know. Tell me what you told me before my first supersonic run." There was a pause, and then, quiet through the static, "I told you fear is just information your body is handing you a little too early. Use it, don't obey it. You were shaking so hard on the ladder I thought you'd fall off it, Marcus." Delgado closed his eyes for half a second inside his oxygen mask. Nobody else alive knew that story. "Command, Whiskey. I'm confirming the identification. It's her. It's really her." Whatever bureaucratic caution had been holding the operation in place broke apart in the next 90 seconds. The senior controller, still working through disbelief of his own, authorized what came next because there was, in truth, no better option left on the table. Kate needed access to that flight deck, and the only door available to her was the aircraft's emergency crew rest hatch above the forward galley, a route she remembered from a dozen technical briefings on this exact airframe family, back when knowing every inch of every aircraft in the sky had been her entire job. A flight attendant, pale and shaking but steady enough to act, helped Kate reach the narrow stairwell leading up into the crew rest compartment while Kate talked her through it in a calm, low voice that had no business sounding as calm as it did. The air grew thicker and more acrid the higher she climbed, a faint chemical bite catching at the back of her throat that confirmed everything she'd guessed from her seat 40 rows back. The stairwell was narrow and hot, the acrid smell growing sharper with every step, and by the time she reached the top her eyes were already stinging. She found the manual release for the flight deck access panel exactly where her memory told her it would be, forced it open against the pressure differential, and dropped down into a cockpit thick with haze, its warning lights bathing both slumped pilots in flickering amber. The master caution panel was a wall of red and amber annunciators, more failures than she could process in a glance, but she didn't need to process all of them, she only needed the ones that mattered in the next 60 seconds. Her training took over before her fear had the chance to. She had spent a decade teaching young pilots that panic was simply information arriving faster than a person could use it, and that the only cure was to slow the clock down inside your own head even when the world outside refused to slow down with you. She forced her breathing into a slow, even rhythm despite the smoke stinging her throat, and let her hands move on their own toward the equipment she remembered from technical manuals she had read years ago and never expected to need again. Working fast, working from instinct and old training rather than conscious thought, Kate pulled the emergency oxygen mask from its stowage and fitted it over the captain's face first, then the first officer's, watching for the first weak stir of consciousness that told her they were still, against every fear she'd carried on the climb up, alive. She yanked the smoke evacuation handle, felt the cabin pressure shift as fresh air began cutting through the haze, and slid into the narrow jump seat behind the controls to check what systems still answered her. Enough of them did. "Command, this is Falcon 1, Kate said into a headset she'd pulled from the unconscious first officer, her voice steady despite hands that hadn't stopped shaking since she dropped through that hatch. Flight deck is stabilizing. Crew is alive, breathing, coming around. I have partial flight control authority and enough instrumentation to get this aircraft on the ground. Requesting vector to nearest suitable runway and full emergency response standing by. On the command net, the controller who had spent the last 20 minutes weighing whether to authorize a missile shot let out a breath that carried down the line like a physical thing. Falcon 1, copy. Vector coming to you now. Whiskey, ice, escort her down. Delgado eased his F-16 into position off Kate's left wing, close enough that through the smoke-streaked windshield she could see him raise one gloved hand and press it flat against his canopy, the same silent salute he'd have given any flight lead who'd just pulled him out of the worst moment of his career. Lead the way, Falcon 1, he said quietly, over a channel now cleared of everyone but the three of them. Like old times. Kate allowed herself something close to a smile, the first and longer than she could remember. Copy, Whiskey. Try to keep up. The descent was slow and careful, the captain, groggy, disoriented, but conscious now and murmuring instructions Kate cross-checked against her own memory of the aircraft's systems, helping guide her through switches she hadn't touched in 5 years but had never truly forgotten. Behind her, one of the flight attendants had begun moving quietly down the aisle, whispering to passengers row by row that the aircraft was descending under control, that help was coming, that the worst of it was over. The cabin, which had spent the last half hour in a fog of whispered fear, slowly softened into something closer to stunned relief, though nobody back there yet knew the name of the woman flying them home. The runway lights of the diversion airfield rose up out of the dark like a promise kept, fire trucks already rolling into position along the taxiways, their red and white lights strobing across 300 exhausted, frightened, and finally safe faces. Kate held the aircraft steady through the last few hundred feet, fighting the unfamiliar sluggishness of controls built for a very different kind of flying than she was used to, her whole body taut with the effort of getting it exactly right. The landing was hard, but it held. The aircraft rolled out under its own weight, engines spooling down, and for a long moment nobody in that cockpit said anything at all. They found Kate Ellison sitting on the tarmac steps an hour later, still wrapped in a foil emergency blanket, watching paramedics load the captain and first officer into an ambulance, both conscious now, both alive because of a delay measured in minutes that had made all the difference. Passengers filed past her toward waiting buses in small, shaken clusters, none of them yet aware that the quiet woman from seat 12A was the reason they were walking off that tarmac instead of not walking off it at all. Delgado walked up in his flight suit, helmet under one arm, and simply stood in front of her for a moment without speaking. They told us you died, he finally said. They needed me to, Kate said quietly. Turns out I wasn't as good at staying dead as they hoped. Delgado studied her for a long moment, then extended his hand. Welcome back, Falcon 1. Kate looked at his hand, then up at the two fighter jets sitting cold on the ramp behind him, engines ticking as they cooled, and for the first time in 5 years felt something in her chest that wasn't quite grief. She shook his hand. Good to be back, Whiskey.